Section 2 of the Story of London. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Paul Lawley-Jones. The Story of London by Henry B. Wheatley. Chapter 1. Introduction. Early History of London to the Norman Conquest. The question as to the great antiquity of London has formed a field for varied and long-continued disputes. An elaborate picture of a British London, founded by Brute, a descendant of Aeneas, as a new Troy, with grand and noble buildings, was painted by Geoffrey of Monmouth. The absurdity of this conception, although it found credence for centuries, was at last seen, and some antiquaries then went to the opposite extreme of denying the very existence of a British London. The solid foundation of facts proving the condition of the earliest London are the waste, marshy ground, with little hills rising from the plains, and the dense forest on the north, a forest that remained almost up to the walls of the city even in historic times, animal remains, flint instruments, and pile dwellings. All the rest is conjecture. We must call in the aid of geography and geology to understand the laws which governed the formation of London. The position of the town on the River Thames proves the wisdom of those who chose the site, although the swampiness of the land, caused by the daily overflowing of the river before the embankments were thrown up, must have endangered its successful colonization. When the vast embankment was completed, the river receded to its proper bed, and the land which was retrieved was still watered by several streams flowing from the higher ground in the north into the Thames. Animal remains, very various in character, have been found in different parts of London. Examples of mammoth, elephant, rhinoceros, elk, deer, and many other extinct as well as existing species are represented. Of man, the mass of flint instruments in the Paleolithic floor, which proves his early existence, is enormous. General Pitt Rivers, then Colonel Lane Fox, in 1867 made the discovery of the remains of pile dwellings near London Wall and in Southwark Street. The piles averaged 6 to 8 inches square, others of a smaller size were 4 inches by 3 inches, and 1 or 2 were as much as a foot square. They were found in the peat just above the virgin gravel, and with them were found the refuse of kitchen middens and broken pottery of the Roman period. There is reason to believe that the piles were sunk by the Britons rather than by the Romans, and General Pitt Rivers was of opinion that they are the remains of the British capital of Cassivelaunus, situated in the Marches, and, of necessity, built on piles. Dr. Monroe, however, who alludes to this discovery in his book on lake dwellings, believes that these piles belong to the post-Roman times, and supposes that in the early Saxon period these pile dwellings were used in the low-lying districts of London. The strongest point of those who disbelieve in a British London is that Julius Caesar does not mention it, but this negative evidence is far from conclusive. We learn from Tacitus that in AD 61 the Roman city was a place of some importance, the chief residence of merchants and the great mart of trade. Therefore we cannot doubt but that to have grown to this condition it must have existed before the Christian era. The Romans appear to have built a fort where the Tower of London now stands, but not originally to have fortified the town. London grew to be a flourishing centre of commerce, though not a place capable of sustaining a siege, so the Roman general, Paulinus Suetonius, would not run the risk of defending it against Boadicea. Afterwards, the walls were erected, and Londinium took its proper position in the Roman Empire. It was on the high road from Rome to York, and the starting point of half the roads in Britain. Bishop Stubbs wrote, "Britain had been occupied by the Romans, but had not become Roman. Probably few Romans settled here. The inhabitants consisted of the governor and the military forces, and Romanized Britons. When the Roman legions left this country, Londinium must have had a very mixed population of traders. There were no leaders, and a wail went up from the defenseless inhabitants. In the year 446, we hear of the groans of the Britons to Aetius, for the third time consul, which took this form of complaint: "The savages drive us to the sea, and the sea casts us back upon the savages. So arise two kinds of death, and we are either drowned or slaughtered." In this place, however, we have not to consider the condition either of British or Roman London, for the Middle Ages may be said to commence with the break-up of the Roman Empire. Saxon London was a wooden city, surrounded by walls, marking out the same enclosure that existed in the latest Roman city. We have the authority of the Saxon Chronicle for saying that in the year 418 the Romans collected all the treasures that were in Britain and hid some of them in the earth. From the date of the departure of the Roman legions to that of the Norman conquest, nearly 6 centuries and a half had elapsed. Of this long period, we find only a few remains, such as some articles discovered in the river, and some entries in that incomparable monument of the past, the Saxon Chronicle. All we really know of Saxondom we learn from the Chronicle, Bede's Ecclesiastical History, and the Old Charters. The history of England for the greater portion of this time was local and insular, for the country was no longer a part of a great empire. Professor Earle tells us that the name London occurs 50 times in the Chronicle, and Londonburh 13 times, but we do not know whether any distinction between the two names was intended to be indicated. The chronicler tells us of the retreat of the Roman legions, and how Hengist and Horsa, invited by Vortigern, king of the Britons, landed in Britain. Then comes the ominous account of the Saxons, who turned against the friends that called upon them for succor and totally defeated the British at Crayford in Kent. Quote, 457. This year Hengist and Aesk, his son, fought against the Britons at the place which is called Creganford, and there slew 4,000 men, and the Britons then forsook Kent, and in great terror fled to Lundenburg. End quote. Then, for a century and a half, there is no further mention of London in the Chronicle. We are not told what became of the fugitives, nor what became of the city. As Lappenberg says, no territory ever passed so obscurely into the hand of an enemy as the north bank of the Thames. It is as difficult to suppose what some have supposed, that the city was deserted and remained desolate for years, as to imagine that trade and commerce continued in the city while all around was strife. There may have been some arrangement by which the successful Saxon who did not care to live in the city agreed that those who wished to do so should live there. But all this is conjecture in the face of this serious blank in our history. If there had been a battle and destruction of the city, we should doubtless have had some account of it in the Chronicle. Gradually, the Saxons settled on the hithes or landing places on the riverside, and at last overcame their natural repugnance to town life and settled in the city. When London is again mentioned in the Chronicle, it appears to have been inhabited by a population of heathens still to be converted. Under the date 604, we are told, quote, this year Augustine consecrated 2 bishops, Mellitus and Justus. He sent Mellitus to preach baptism to the East Saxons, whose king was called Sebert, son of Ricol, the sister of Ethelbert, and whom Ethelbert had then appointed king. And Ethelbert gave Mellitus a bishop's see at Londonwick, and to Justus he gave Rochester, which is 24 miles from Canterbury. End quote. The Christianity of the Londoners was of an unsatisfactory character, for after the death of Sebert, his sons, who were heathens, stirred up the multitude to drive out their bishop. Mellitus became Archbishop of Canterbury, and London again relapsed into heathenism. In this, the earliest period of Saxon London recorded for us, there appears to be no relic left of the Christianity of the Britons which at one time was well in evidence. Godwin recorded a list of 16 ecclesiastics, styled by him Archbishops of London, and Lenève adopted the list in his Fasti Ecclesiae Anglicanae on the authority of Godwin. The list begins with Theanus during the reign of Lucius, king of the Britons in the latter half of the 2nd century. The second is Eluanus, who was said to have been sent on an embassy to Eleutherius, Pope from AD 171 to 185. The 12th on the list is Restitutus, whose name is found on the list of prelates present at the Council of Arles in the year 314. Perhaps the answer to the question as to the extinction of British Christianity in London is to be found in Geoffrey of Monmouth's statement that when the Saxons drove the British fugitives into Wales and Cornwall, Theon, the 16th and last on the list of British bishops, fled into Wales with the Archbishop of Caerleon, the Bishop Thadiac of York, and their surviving clergy. The traditional date of this flight is AD 586, not many years before the appearance of Mellitus. Geoffrey of Monmouth is not a very trustworthy authority, but there is no reason to doubt his belief in his own story, and it is interesting to note that he specially mentions Theonus. At all events, we know from other sources that there were bishops of London during the Roman period. The bold statement that King Lucius founded the Church of St. Peter, Cornhill, can scarcely be said to find any credence among historians of the present day. But a reference of the doings of this ancient king will be found embedded in the statute book of St. Paul's Cathedral. Quote, "In the year from the incarnation of the Lord 185, at the request of Lucius, the king of Greater Britain, which is now called England, there were sent from Eleutherius, the Pope, to the aforesaid king, 2 illustrious doctors, Fagnus and Dumanus, who should incline the heart of the king and of his subject people to the unity of the Christian faith, and should consecrate to the honor of the one true and supreme God the temples which had been dedicated to various and false deities." End quote. To return from the wild statements of tradition to the facts of sober history, we find that London, after the driving out of Mellitus, remained without a bishop until the year 656, when Cedar, brother of St. Chad of Lichfield, was invited to London by Sigibert, who had been converted to Christianity by Finan, bishop of the Northumbrians. Cedar was consecrated bishop of the East Saxons by Finan about 656, and held the see till his death on the 26th of October 664. The list of bishops from Cedar to William, who is addressed in the Conqueror's Charter, is a long one, and each of these bishops apparently held a position of great importance in the government of the city. In the 7th century, the city seems to have settled down into a prosperous place and to have been peopled by merchants of many nationalities. We learn that at this time it was the great mart of slaves. It was, in the fullest sense, a free trading town, neutral to a certain extent between the kingdoms around, although the most powerful of the kings successively obtained some authority over it when they conquered their feebler neighbors. As to this, there is still more to be said. During the 8th century, when a more settled condition of life became possible, the trade and commerce of London increased in volume and prosperity. A change, however, came about towards the end of the century when the Scandinavian freebooters, known to us as Danes, began to harry our coasts. The Saxons had become law-abiding, and the fierce Danes treated them in the same way that in former days they had treated the Britons. Freeman divided the Danish invasions into 3 periods. 1. 787 to 855, a period when the object was simply plunder. 2. 902 to 954, attempts made at settlement. 3. 980 to 1016. During this period, the history of England was one record of struggle with the power of Denmark till Canute became undisputed king of England. We still have much to learn as to the movements of the Danes in this country, and when the old charters are more thoroughly investigated, we shall gain a great accession of light. Thus we learn from an Anglo-Saxon charter, printed in de Grey Birch's Cartularium Saxonicum, that in the year 872 a great tribute was paid to the Danes which is not mentioned in the chronicle. London was specially at the mercy of the fierce sailors of the north, and the times when the city was in their hands are almost too numerous for record here. Even when Alfred concluded with Guthrun in 878 the Treaty of Wedmore, as it is still commonly called, and by which the country was divided between the English and the Danes, London suffered much. With the reign of Alfred, we come to the consideration of a very difficult question in the history of London. It has been claimed for this king that he rebuilt London. Mr. Lofty expresses this view in the very strongest terms. He writes, quote, "So important, however, is this settlement, so completely must it be regarded as the ultimate fact in any continuous narrative relating to the history of London, that it would be hardly wrong to commence with some such sentence as this. London was founded exactly 1,000 years ago by King Alfred, who chose for the site of his city a place formerly fortified by the Romans, but desolated successively by the Saxons and the Danes." End quote. There is certainly no evidence for so sweeping a statement. Nothing in the chronicle can be construed to contain so wide a meaning. The passage upon which this mighty superstructure has been formed is merely this. Quote, 886. In the same year King Alfred restored, Gesetzte, London, and all the Angle race returned to him that were not in the bondage of the Danish men. And he then committed the burh to the keeping of the Alderman Ethered. End quote. The great difficulty in this passage is the word Gesetzte, which probably means occupied, but may mean much more, as founded or settled. Some authorities have therefore changed the word to beset, besieged. Professor Earle proposed the following solution of the problem, which seems highly probable. London was a flourishing, populous, and opulent city, the chief emporium of commerce in the island, and the residence of foreign merchants. Properly, it had become an Angle city, the chief city of the Anglian nation of Mercia, but the Danes had settled there in great numbers, and they had many captives whom they had taken in the late wars. Thus the Danes preponderated over the free Angles, and the latter were glad to see Alfred come and restore the balance in their favour. It was of the greatest importance for Alfred to secure this city, not only the capital of Mercia, but able to do what Mercia had not done, to bar the passage of pirate ships to the upper Thames. Accordingly, Alfred in 886 planted the garrison of London, i.e., introduced a military colony of men, and gave them land for their maintenance, in return for which they lived in and about a fortified position under a commanding officer. Professor Earle would not have Londonburh taken as merely an equivalent to London. Alfred therefore founded not London itself, but the burh of London. Under Athelstan we find the city increasing in importance and general prosperity. There were then 8 mints at work, which shows great activity and the need of coin for the purposes of trade. The folkmoot met in the precincts of St. Paul's at the sound of the bell, which also rang out when the armed levy was required to march under St. Paul's banner. For some years after the decisive battle of Brunanburh, 937, the Danes ceased to trouble the country, but one may affirm that fire was almost as great an enemy as the Dane. Fabian, when recording the entire destruction of London by fire in the reign of Ethelred, 981, makes this remarkable statement. Quote, "Ye shall understand that this day the city of London had most housing and building from Ludgate toward Westminster, and little or none where the chief or heart of the city is now, except that in divers places were housing, but they stood without order." End quote. The good government of Athelstan and his successors kept the country free from foreign freebooters, but when Ethelred II, called the Unready, or rather the Reedless, came to the throne, the Danes saw their opportunity. In 991 he tried to bribe his enemies to stay away, and was the first English king to institute the Danegeld, which was for so many years a severe tax upon the resources of the country. The bribe was useless, and the enemy had to be bought off again. A Danish fleet threatened London in 992, and in 994 Olaf, or Anlaf, Tryggvason, who appears first as harrier of English soil in 988, with Sweyn, the Danish king, laid siege to London, but they failed to take it. They then harried, burned, and slew all along the sea coasts of Essex, Kent, Sussex, and Hampshire. The English paid £10,000 to the Danes in 991, and in 994 they had to produce the still larger sum of £16,000 in order to purchase peace. Olaf then promised never again to visit England except in peace. Subsequently, Ethelred brought disaster upon himself and his country by his treachery. In 1002 he issued secret orders for a massacre of all the Danes found in England, and in this massacre Gunhild, sister of Sweyn, was among the victims. In consequence of Ethelred's conduct, the Danes returned in force to these shores, and had to be bought off with a sum of £36,000. They came again and made many unsuccessful assaults upon London, upon which the chronicler remarks, quote, "They often fought against the town of London, but to God be praised that it yet stands sound, and they have ever fared ill." End quote. In 1010 Ethelred took shelter in London, and in 1013 Sweyn again attacked the city without success, but having conquered a great part of England, the Londoners submitted to him, and Ethelred fled to Normandy. After Sweyn's death in 1014, Ethelred was invited to return to England, as the country was not willing to receive Sweyn's son Canute as its king. When Ethelred returned to England, he was accompanied by another Olaf, Anlaf Haraldsson, who succeeded by a clever maneuver in destroying the wooden London Bridge and taking the city out of the hands of the Danes. The story is told in Snorro Sturluson's Heimskringla, the story of Olaf the Holy, the son of Harald. Quote, Olaf covered the decks of his ship with a roof of wood and wickerwork to protect them from the stones and shot which were ready to be cast at them by the Danes. King Olaf and the host of the Northmen rode right up under the bridge and lashed cables round the poles that upheld the bridge, and then they fell to their oars and rowed all the ships downstream as hard as they might. The poles dragged along the ground, even until they were loosened under the bridge. But inasmuch as an host under weapons stood thickly arrayed on the bridge, there were on it both many stones and many war weapons, and the poles having broken from it, the bridge broke down by reason thereof, and many of the folk fell into the river. But all the rest thereof fled from the bridge, some into the city, some into Southwark. And after this they made an onset on Southwark, and won it. And when the townsfolk saw that the river Thames was won, so that they might not hinder the ships from faring up into the land, they were afeard, and gave up the town, and took King Ethelred in. End quote. The later life of Olaf was one of adventure. He was driven by Canute from his kingdom of Norway, and took shelter in Sweden. Here he obtained help, and in the end regained his throne. At the Battle of Stiklestad he was defeated and slain, 1030. His body was hastily buried, but was afterwards taken up, and, being found incorrupt, was buried in great state in a shrine at Trondheim. He was canonized, and several English churches are dedicated to him. There are 4 parishes bearing the name of St. Olav in London. One of the churches is in Tooley Street, which also preserves the name of St. Olav in a curiously corrupted form. After this, Ethelred succeeded in driving Canute out of England back to Denmark. Of this success, Freeman enthusiastically wrote, quote, That true-hearted city was once more the bulwark of England, the centre of every patriotic hope, the special object of every hostile attack." End quote. There was, however, little breathing space, for Canute returned to England in 1015, and Ethelred's brilliant son, Edmund Ironside, prepared to meet him. Edmund's army refused to fight unless Ethelred came with them, and unless they had the support of the citizens of London. Before, however, Canute arrived, Ethelred died. England was in the hand of the Dane, and London only remained free. Edmund was elected king by the Witan, united with the inhabitants of the city, and thus the Londoners first asserted the position which they held to for many centuries, of their right to a voice in the election of the king. Canute was determined now to succeed, and he at once sailed up the Thames. He was, however, unable to pass the bridge, which had been rebuilt. He therefore dug a trench on the south side of the river, by which means he was enabled to draw some of his ships above the bridge. He also cut another trench entirely round the wall of the city. In spite of this clever scheme, the determined resistance of our stubborn forefathers caused it to fail. Edmund Ironside was successful in his battles with Canute, till his brother-in-law, Eadric, alderman of Mercia, turned traitor, and helped the Danish king to vanquish the English army at Assendon, now Assenton in Kent. Edmund was now forced to agree to Canute's terms, and it was therefore settled that Edmund should retain his crown and take all England south of the Thames, together with East Anglia, Essex, and London, Canute taking the rest of the kingdom. On the 30th November 1016, Edmund died, and Canute became king of the whole of England. His reign was prosperous, and he succeeded in gaining the esteem of his subjects, who appreciated the long-continued peace which he brought them. Dr. Stubbs describes him as one of the conscious creators of England's greatness. He died in November 1035 at the early age of 40. We may now pass over some troubled times, caused by the worthless successors of Canute, and come to the period when the West Saxon line was restored in the person of Edward the Confessor, who, being educated at the Norman court, became more a Norman than an Englishman, and prepared the way for the Conqueror's success. The Confessor was but an indifferent king, although he holds a more distinguished place in history than many a more heroic figure as the practical founder of Westminster Abbey, where his shrine is still one of its most sacred treasures. When Edward died, the Witan, which had attended his funeral, elected to succeed him Harold, the foremost man in England, and the leader who had attempted to check the spread of the far too wide Norman influence. After conquering his outlawed brother Tostig and Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, at Stamford Bridge, he had to hurry back to meet William, Duke of Normandy, which he did on a hill on the Sussex Downs, afterwards called Senlac. He closed his life on the field of battle after a reign of 40 weeks and 1 day. Then the conqueror had the country at his mercy, but he recognized the importance of London's position and moved forward with the greatest caution and tact. The citizens of London were possibly a divided body, and William, knowing that he had many friends in the city, felt that a waiting game was the best for his cause in the end. His enemies, led by Ansgar the Staller, under whom as sheriff the citizens of London had marched to fight for Harold at Senlac, managed to get their way at first. They elected Edgar Atheling, the grandson of Edmund Ironside, as king, but this action was of little avail. When William arrived at Southwark, the citizens sallied forth to meet him, but they were beaten back, and had to save themselves within the city walls. William retired to Berkhamsted, and is said to have sent a private message to Ansgar asking for his support. In the end, the citizens, probably led by William the Bishop, who was a Norman, came over to the conqueror's side, and the best men repaired to Berkhamsted. Here they accepted the sovereignty of William, who received their oath of fealty. Thus ends the Saxon period of our history, and the Norman period in London commences with the Conqueror's charter to William the Bishop and Gosfrith the Portreeve, supposed to be the elder Geoffrey de Mandeville. In the foregoing pages, the main incidents of the history of Saxon London are recited. These are, I fear, rather disconnected and uninteresting, but it is necessary to set down the facts in chronological order, because from them we can draw certain conclusions as to the condition of London before the Norman Conquest. Unfortunately, our authorities for the Saxon period do not tell us much that we want to know, and, in consequence, many of the suggestions made by one authority are disputed by another. Still, we can draw certain very definite conclusions which cannot well be the subjects of contention. The first fact is the constant onward march of London towards the fulfillment of its great destiny. Trouble surrounded it on all sides, but, in spite of them all, the citizens gained strength in adversity, so that at the Conquest the city was in possession of those special privileges which were cherished for centuries, never given up, but increased when opportunity occurred. Patient waiting was therefore rewarded by success, and London, by the endeavours of her men, grew in importance and stood before all other cities in her unique position. The governor who possessed the confidence of Londoners, although all the rest of the country was against him, need not to despair, while he who had the support of the rest of the country, but was opposed by London, could not be considered as triumphant. The so-called heptarchy was constantly changing the relative positions of its several parts, until Egbert, the King of Wessex, became Rex Totius Britanniae, AD 827. The seven kingdoms were, at some hypothetical period, Kent, Sussex, Wessex, Essex, south of the Thames; East Anglia, Mercia, north of the Thames; Northumbria, including Deira and Bernicia, north of the Humber and as far north as the Forth. The walled city of London was a distinct political unit, although it owed a certain allegiance to one of the kingdoms, which was the most powerful for the time being. This allegiance therefore frequently changed, and London retained its identity and individuality all through. Essex seems seldom to have held an independent position, for when London first appears as connected with the East Saxons, the real power was in the hands of the King of Kent. According to Bede, Winnie, being expelled from his bishopric of Wessex in 635, took refuge with Wulfhere, king of the Mercians, of whom he purchased the see of London. Hence, the Mercian king must then have been the overlord of London. Not many years afterwards, the King of Kent again seems to have held some jurisdiction here. From the laws of the Kentish kings, Lothair and Eadric, 673 to 685, we learn that the Wick-Reeve was an officer of the King of Kent, who exercised a jurisdiction over the Kentish men trading with or at London, or who was appointed to watch over their interests. There is a very interesting question connected with the position of the two counties in which London is situated. It is necessary to remember that London is older than these counties, whose names, viz., Middlesex and Surrey, indicate their relative position to the city and the surrounding country. We have neither record of their settlement nor of the origin of their names. Both must have been peopled from the river. The name Middle Saxons clearly proves that Middlesex must have been settled after the East and West Saxons had given their names to their respective districts. There has been much discussion as to the etymology of Surrey, more particularly of the second syllable. A once favourite explanation was that Surrey stood for South Kingdom, Anglo-Saxon Riki, but there is no evidence that Surrey ever was a kingdom, and this etymology must surely be put aside. In Elton's Origins of English History there is the following note. Quote, 3 under-kings concur in a grant by the King of Surrey. End quote. This is a serious misstatement, for the document cited says, ego Frithwaldus Pruincie Surianorum subregulus regis Wulfari Mercianorum, dono concedo, etc. Frithwald is here described as subregulus, under-king, subject to the king of the Mercians, and in the attestation clause it is added, et isti sunt subreguli qui omnes sub signo suo subscripserunt. Their names are Frithwald, Osric, Wigherd, and Ethelwald. Each is described as testis merely. This does not seem to imply concurrence, but, even if it does, the title subregulus does not mean an independent sovereign. In the description of the boundaries of the granted land, which is in Anglo-Saxon, the grantor is certainly described as Frithwald king, but this cannot mean king in the full sense, and the Anglo-Saxon clause in the Charter could not have been intended to contradict the Latin, which designates Frithwald as subregulus throughout. Dr. Stubbs, after describing the gradual disappearance of the smaller sovereignties, and pointing out that the heptarctic king was as much stronger than the tribal king as the king of United England was stronger than the heptarctic king, wrote, quote, in Wessex, besides the kings of Sussex, which has a claim to be numbered among the 7 great states, were kings of Surrey also. End quote. The note to this, however, only refers to Frithwald, subregulus or ealdorman of Surrey, and no mention is made of any ruler who was capable of making Surrey into a kingdom. The form of the name used by Bede, in Regione Sudergeona, may suggest a derivation quite different from any yet suggested. Surrey was originally an integral part of Kent, and when it was severed from that county, it became, apparently, an independent district, a sort of republic under its own alderman. In later times it became subject to the neighbouring kingdoms. At the date of this charter, it was under Mercia. It was never reckoned as a separate member of the Heptarchy. London fought an uphill fight with Winchester for the position of chief city of southern England. Under Egbert, London grew in importance, but Winchester, the chief town of Wessex, was still the more important place politically. In the trade regulations enacted by Edgar in the 10th century, London took precedence of Winchester. Quote, let one measure and one weight pass such as is observed at London and at Winchester. End quote. In the reign of Edward the Confessor, London had become the recognized capital of England. Some dispute has arisen respecting the position of the Lithsmen, who appear at the election in Oxford of Canute's successor, and subsequently. Freeman describes them as seafaring men of London, while Grose writes, quote, the Lithsmen, shipowners, of London, who, with others, raised Harold to the throne, were doubtless such burgthanes. End quote. Another important point to be noted is the prominent political position of the bishop. As early as AD 900, the bishop and the reeves who belonged to London are recorded as making in the name of the citizens laws which were confirmed by the king, because they had reference to the whole kingdom. Edward the Confessor greeted William Bishop, Harold Earl, and Esgar Staller, so that William the Conqueror followed precedent when he addressed his charter to bishop and portreeve. Foreigners in early times occupied an important position in London, but there was serious complaint when Edward the Confessor enlarged the numbers of the Normans. The Englishman always had a hatred of the foreigner, and this dislike grew as time went on, and the English tried to obtain the first place and succeeded in the attempt. Other points, such as government by folkmoots and guilds, which will be discussed in the following chapters, find their origin in the Saxon period. The government of London under the Saxons was of a simple character, approximating to that of the Shire, and so it continued until some years after the Conquest. When the commune was extorted from the crown, a fuller system of government was inaugurated, which will be discussed in a later chapter. End of Chapter 1. End of Section 2.